an honor for me to speak on behalf of the Friday Forum. Let me begin to warm welcome for all the participants. Welcome to the Friday Forum, to the Dean of to the Dean, Dr. Abdul Rahman M.Hu, to the First Dean, Dr. Wahyu Triatmojo, Second Dean, Dr. Masito Warni Siregar MED, and the Third Dean, Dr. Marichen Hum. Before we start, I would like to express my appreciation to the faculty, department, program study, and also Teflin. In this case is Teflin Sumatra Utara or North Sumatra, which is led by Dr. Masito Warni, MED, as our second dean. Thank you for collaborating and help us. In today FGD, we would like learn from our speaker, Associate Prof. Tony Dobinson from Curtin University, Australia, with the theme Translanguaging, English Only and Silence in University Classroom. Okay, that's the title. Last but not least, I would like to deliver the speech to the head of department in English department in Universitas Negeri Medan, to give some warm welcome also to the speaker. And I don't want to take much of your time. I have to give it to our head department. Please, our head department, to give it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Is my voice audible, everybody?
Yes, very clear.
Loud and clear? Okay, thank you. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everybody. Allow me in this occasion to say a few words on behalf of the English Language and Literature Department. First, I would like to express our thanks to our speaker today, Associate Professor Tony Dobinson from Curtin University. It's an honor to be able to invite and welcome you to our Friday Forum webinar. Secondly, I would like to acknowledge the hard work that the committee has invested in making this event possible, including the participation of Teflin North Sumatra chapter. I hope all the participants can benefit from this webinar. Thank you. I will hand over now to Mr. Chair. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Sanasir.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I just closed my voice. I forgot to open. Okay, now I would like to invite our dean. In this case, is represented by our second dean as a leader or chief of Teflin, and also to open this FGD. So the second dean, please. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. It is an honor to be in the presence of esteemed guests and distinguished members of our academic community. Our esteemed keynote speaker, Associate Professor Tony Dobinson from Curtin University. We really hope that someday you can come here, Prof. Yeah. And then the Honorable all Vice Deans of Faculty of Language and Arts, and then the head of department, the head of Friday Forum, and then the Honorable Board of Teflin. We also invite some of the Teflin members are here, and the Honorable head of, the Honorable Chief of Friday Forum, and all the audiences. Welcome to the Friday Forum on Translanguaging English Only and Silence in the University Classroom. Today, we gathered to explore the transformative power of translanguaging, discuss the importance of inclusivity in our languages practices, and delve into the profound significance of meaningful silence in the academic setting. As a representative of the Dean of the Faculty of Languages and Arts, and also traveling coordinator, I'm deeply committed to promoting excellence in language education and fostering an inclusive and dynamic learning environment. Let us engage in open and respectful dialogue as we seek to create an environment that enriches the learning experience for all. Okay, Prof. Tony Robinson, I'd like to emphasize that in Indonesia, we have a variety of classrooms of teaching English. In remote areas, sometimes English is not open even in the classroom. Because in Indonesia, sometimes in the classroom, they have mother tongues, which is probably Bataknese, Karonese, and then English teachers speak in the language. The English teachers speak in Karonese or Bataknese. And then the second language is Bahasa Indonesia. They even didn't understand Bahasa sometimes. They just speak the language, the mother tongue. And now we come to this English. So it's really very interesting now. This is now phenomenon that we now have inclusivity. It is now open that we think of our students, and then we use our students to drive them, to move them into the language that we are teaching. So we really expect to hear from you, Prof. Tony Robinson, because it is really the practices in Indonesia. Yeah, and now you have it now in the setting of university. So thank you for gracing up your presence on this momentous occasion. Let's make this Friday Forum a memorable and enlightening experience for everyone. On behalf of the Dean of Faculty of Languages and Art, I'm also as the coordinator of Chapel Sumatera Utara. So on behalf of the Dean, Bapak Dr. Abdurrahman Hadis Abdul Rahimum, by saying Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, we open this webinar officially. Thank you. Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I think Mr. Chair will hand it over to Ms. Moderator, because Ms. Moderator will read your bio notes for a while.
Right.
And then after that, we can start. Yes, Mr. Chair.
Now it's time. I think the moderator might give some biography of our speaker.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Nasir, as the chief of the Friday Forum webinars today, for the opportunity given to me. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's Friday Forum webinar on translanguaging, English only and silence in the university classroom. I am Yuni Hairina, and I will be your moderator for this session. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in today's webinar, we will explore the concept of translanguaging and its implication for language learning and teaching in the classroom. As we know that translanguaging refers to the practice of using multiple languages in communication to facilitate understanding and learning. So our esteemed speaker today will shed a light on the advantages and challenges of using translanguaging in the classroom, as well as the impact of English-only policies and moments of silence of language learners, especially in the university context. So, ladies and gentlemen, while listening to the presentation later, I would like to invite all the participants to share your thoughts or questions on translanguaging by using the chat feature. And then we'll be selecting some of your questions for the Q&A sessions at the end. And for your information, the attendance list will be shared to the audience in the Q&A session later. Well, now without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished speaker. We have the Associate Professor Tony Robinson. She is an expert in linguistics and language education with extensive research in translanguaging practices. Before we welcome our distinguished speaker today, let me read the summary of her CV. So here, Ms. Tony Robinson is one of the teaching staff at Curtin University. She's also the coordinator of the postgraduate programs in applied linguistics including the MA Applied Linguistics, the MTESOL, and the Graduate Certificate in TESOL. She is also the Discipline Lead for Applied Linguistics, or TESOL, and Languages. She has many years of teaching and research experience overseas in Egypt and the Sultanate of Oman. She has coordinated and taught the MA Applied Linguistics for over 20 years, including offshore in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. She also teaches the Language and Diversity Unit of the BED Early Childhood, Primary, and supervises higher degree by research students. She has published in the areas of language education, classroom research, translanguaging, and linguistic racism. The title of her PhD was Investigating the Teaching and Learning Experiences of Asian Postgraduate Students and Their Lectures in Australia and Vietnam. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please allow me to welcome Ms. Toni Dobinson to share her insight on translanguaging, English only and silence in the university classroom. To Associate Professor Toni Dobinson, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I'm presuming I share my screen, is that right? I'll try and do that. Is that working?
Yeah, we can see
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
I need to put it into full.
Screen.
Yeah. There. Okay. Okay, so everyone can see and hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all, and especially to Ariadne for inviting me. This is a topic that's probably quite close to my heart, and so I'm very happy to present on it. And I've also, just to let you know, the team, it's not just me, so this topic is really, and this project is shared by myself, Dr. Chen Gong, Dr. Paul Machir, Dr. Senda Dalchin, and Stephanie Dryden, who's a postgraduate student, HDR student of mine. And we also, a couple of us actually presented this about a week ago in Brussels too. So hopefully I've had a little bit of a chance to rehearse it, but you never know what might happen. So you have to stick with me, I'm afraid. Okay, so just before I start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the past and present traditional owners of this land on which the project was conducted, which is Western Australia, and in particular the Perth region. And that is the land, the traditional land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We acknowledge that it's a privilege to be able to conduct our research in or on Noongar country, and we recognise the unique and incomparable contribution that the Whadjuk people have made to the land and to our community, and continue to make to our culture as well. And we will continue, hopefully, if we can, to seek the input of these traditional owners in all the research that we do. And we will also, the land on which we meet and study at Perth University in Perth, we acknowledge will always be Noongar land and was actually never seceded. Okay, and the reason we, just to let you know why we do this acknowledgement of country, in case you're wondering, is because, as you know, we are not the first peoples in this land, but we have First Nations people who were here a long time before us, and who we are indebted to for allowing them to allow us to live on their land. Okay, so just before I start, just to set the scene a little, I think a lot of people have this idea that Australia is quite a sort of homogenous kind of a land in terms of language, not so much in terms of culture. Everyone talks about multiculturalism, but in terms of languages, because English is the dominant language, we tend to forget that it is actually very multilingual. So here are just a few figures from the recent census, just to set the scene. The 2021 Australian Bureau of Statistics showed that we have actually 250 ancestries and 350 languages in our population of 5.5 million. And that means that we have in our population of 20 million, and that means we have 5.5 million of those people using a language other than English in their daily lives, either at home or possibly within their communities. We also have almost half of Australians have a parent born overseas, that's 48%, and 1 in 4 Australians was born internationally. So these are big statistics that you have to think about when you are deciding to do everything in English. And Perth, despite being one of the most remote cities in the world, Ariadne would probably attest to that. Once you're here, you feel quite isolated. Actually has the largest overseas born population of any of the states in Australia. And this is actually rising. We're getting a lot of immigration. We have a lot of refugees coming in. We have a lot of international students. So our multilingual populations are doubling and will continue to do so. They've done that over the last 10 years and they will continue. So this is to set the scene why we're sort of arguing for this whole concept of translanguaging in our research. And it feeds into this idea really that we can no longer see English as the only vehicle really for conveying information, particularly as I've just pointed out, the vast majority of people living in Australia have English as an additional language. Unfortunately, despite these figures, at the moment anyway, we're not really tapping into the translingual resources of our students. And we've got this sort of what Klein called a monolingual mindset, which we need to alter. And we need to sort of tweak, if you like, these monolingual norms that are being sort of enforced, not just in universities, I might add, but also I work in the primary school sector I collaborate. I'm not actually a primary school teacher, but I do collaborations with primary schools. And in the school I'm in currently, 70% of the class have a language other than English, and we have 10 languages in there, and still everything is delivered in English with no regard for this incredible translingual sort of resource that we have in the room. So English is privileged, which I guess you might expect in a place that was once, you know, a colony of England. But what we're trying to do is to foster translanguaging practices that can disrupt this linguistic inequality and disparity. And my colleague, Senda Dovchin, who's also a team member on this project, has written extensively on this, as have I suppose. So when we're talking about translanguaging, I noticed when you introduced the topic, I think it was it Eldia that said this? I'm not sure, but one person anyway talked about just moving fluidly between languages, which is what Saya defined as translanguaging. So you can use any of your languages, any of your existing languages to meet the communicative needs of your situation. And especially in a classroom, you can use any languages you like. That's the idea of translanguaging. However, language has now been theorized a little bit more than just languages as bordered languages, such as English, Bahasa, Arabic. They are bordered languages. We now think of languages borderless. So it's more of a fragmented system rather than distinct separate languages, because many people speak little bits of languages, and not even just bits of languages, they'll speak little bits of varieties of languages. You know, they'll speak a little bit of computer language, which we all have to have now, and they might speak a little bit of sort of informal language and a bit of academic language. So we're seeing that language differently. We're now talking about languaging as a verb rather than language itself. You're languaging every time you're communicating, no matter what you're using to communicate. And Kanagaraja in particular has pushed this idea that we need to consider spatial resources around us also as part of translanguaging. So, you know, you can use your body, paralinguistics, you can use your face, you can use visuals, pictures, photographs, drawings. You can use your friend. If there's someone sitting next to you, you can say, oh, you know, what is that word? Oh, gee, I just can't think what that word is. Can you help me? What is that word? And then this happens all the time, particularly for someone like me who's getting older. I use people around me all the time because I keep forgetting words, even in my own language. So I asked them, what's that word? Oh, gee, what is it? Well, that's a form of translanguaging. You're drawing on all your resources to communicate. And in particular, one huge one, which a lot of teachers and university lecturers have difficulty with, is students drawing on their computer as a translanguaging resource, or even their Google Translate as a translanguaging resource. It's basically anything that you can draw on to help you get your message across in whatever language, whatever, it could even be Auslan, it could be sign language if you are familiar with the language of the deaf. In Australia, that's Auslan. Well, that also is a language and is considered so in our exam system, in that they take the Auslan speakers take the same exams in year 12 as the English as an additional language speakers, because Auslan is considered to be another language. And also our Aboriginal students in year 12 take the same exam as English as an additional language speakers, because they speak Aboriginal English, which again is considered to be another variety other than Australian Standard English. So they have a more opportunity in that course. Okay, so our research questions then for our study were basically looking at how do Chinese students, so the study was actually pretty huge. We even went to Mauritius, our Curtin campus in Mauritius, to conduct this study, to have a look at how students there were translanguaging between Creole, French and English, and also sometimes Hindi over there. But the part that I'm going to report here is really only the part that we did at Curtin, and we did it in some classes in the School of Education, and we basically focused on our Chinese students, international students, and we asked, how do these students communicate during discussion tasks? And we just looked at two classes that were, I think they were students taking the Humanities International Business units. And we looked at what barriers there might be to these students communicating during discussion tasks in these classes. So we basically sat in on lessons and observed and recorded what was going on in the groups between the students. And we also spoke to the students afterwards about their experiences. So here's the methodology. I don't know if you're familiar with linguistic ethnography, but that's our particular area of expertise. It's basically ethnography, which just means, getting into people's worlds, shadowing them in the environment that they live in, if it be a classroom or a workplace. And in this instance, in just ethnography, you might focus on everything that's going on, but in linguistic ethnography, you only focus on language and how that's being used. What's different to other kinds of research is this really relies on you going and sitting in and watching and observing either in classrooms or in workplaces or in community events. It's not just about interviewing. Our positionality on the team, we're very lucky. We've got, 4 of the team were migrants. Well, I don't know if you ever are not a migrant. I don't think you say you were a migrant. I think we are migrants. I'm definitely still a migrant. With different backgrounds. So I'm a migrant from England, so I would have had different experiences to, say, someone like Sender, who was a migrant from Mongolia, and Chen, who was a migrant from China. And then we also had Steph, who's born and bred Australian, to keep the sort of the balance, if you like, and so that we didn't all start assuming that our students were having the same experience as us as migrants, and she was able to sort of moderate and keep some balance into our position. 2 classes, as I said, international business major and ethnographic observations, digital audio recordings, and then interviews. And then analysis was basically the interviews were analysed thematically, and the open ethnographic observations were analysed using critical discourse analysis. And keep an eye on the time here. So I've got the next, I think, 2 slides. just examples of what we found from listening to the students. And this looks a little bit dense, so I'll try and summarize it sort of to make it more manageable to understand. Basically, what we're looking at here is, or what we were interested in, was the amount of silence shown in this particular interaction between students. And I wanted to highlight it in yellow, but I wasn't able to do it because I screenshotted this and it wouldn't let me do it. But if you just look at line 3, line 5, sorry, not line 5, line 3, then line 13, then line 17, you can see that there's quite a bit of silence, particularly the one at 13, where it's 153 seconds, which is, you know, a lot of silence. And what we were interested in here was, why did this happen? Why did the silence come about? Initial thought was it's because they don't have the English, the language, right? Which is what you would expect. These are Chinese students, probably came in with an IELTS of 6.5. They may also be in a group with born and bred Australians, which might intimidate them. But in fact, in this group, it was only then. They were in a larger group, but they sort of broke off into a subgroup of just Chinese students. The other thing you might think is when you look at the task that the teacher's asking, you know, what is racism? That's quite a big question. But it's also a question that doesn't lead them very far. Once they've defined it, which they sort of do, because they say, what do they say? Racism means a person who shows fear, discrimination with prejudice against people of another race. So they've kind of summed that up pretty well, really, in my opinion. So here we have to step back and not be too quick to say there was silence here because there was not an opportunity to translanguage and there was not enough English. But in fact, it could have been the task that was the issue, why they sort of shut up. And in fact, if you look at the end or the next slide as well, you can see that the lecturer, in this case, really quite encourages them to use other languages as well. She says, you know, you can discuss in Chinese and then you can conclude in English. So this is a case where the teacher is totally on board with allowing these students to translanguage, but it doesn't seem that they want to take that opportunity. The other group in the other class were a little different. They launched straight off using, in this case, Mandarin. And fortunately, because one of our team members is a Mandarin speaker, Chen, she was sitting in with this group. And so she was able to listen to what they were saying and translate what they were saying. And you can see that what they're doing is they're communicating and saying they're really quite unsure what to do in this task. You know, what did she ask us to discuss? Is it this one? Yeah. Is it this one? Is it? Yeah. Is it this one? I don't know, really don't know what this phrase means. And then a heavy sigh. Oh. So they're obviously experiencing some frustration here. And then you can see the amount of silence, mumbling and silence, 85 seconds, 153 seconds. So they really didn't take off with this task. They were just stymied the whole way. And I mean, they did use Chinese to express the fact they couldn't understand, but then for some reason they just stopped. They didn't continue using the Chinese to get any further with it. And later when we asked them about this, they actually admitted it was because one of us was sitting in the room quite near to them. It was Chen actually. And they suddenly did a quick check and thought, oh no, we mustn't be speaking in Chinese. It's not allowed. We shouldn't be doing that. So they stopped themselves, which was a shame because I think possibly they could have got to where they needed to be if they just continued to speak in their own language. I mean, we'll never know. This is just me, you know, speculating. When we asked them in the interviews, we got a bit better insight. So this, I think, was for the first class. And I'm just going to look at my own copy because I did actually highlight what I needed to just focus on. It's going to help me a bit. So if we look at student A, he says, yes, I think the most reasons, if I can speak English very well, I'll have enough confidence to talk with others. So obviously this word confidence is huge. Even if they are proficient speakers, they don't feel that they are. So they hold back because of lack of confidence. And the interviewer then says, oh, so you're a bit shy or quiet because of your English? And he says, yeah, it's not enough, meaning my English is not enough. And then Mrs. Chen she says, oh, so that's why you were chatting in Chinese, and then all of a sudden you see everybody change. And he says, yes, because basically the English is not enough, but we also felt sort of guilty or like we would be disapproved of if we spoke in Chinese. In the next interview, I think Chen did most of the interviews with these boys because, again, she did ask them as well, do you want to be interviewed in English or in Mandarin? Some of them said they would only want to be interviewed in English but then resorted to a little bit of Mandarin. But these ones in particular, again, proving our point, they only wanted to be interviewed in English, even though it probably would have been a lot easier for them, and we probably would have got richer data if they spoke to us in Chinese. But they're so fearful of ever stepping out of that dominant discourse of English that they will be somehow judged, or, you know, we might tell their parents who are paying a lot of money for them to do these courses. There's all these pressures that they experience to just constantly perform in English when it's not necessary. This is not an English language class, it's a content class, so it's not necessary, but they are so indoctrinated from their previous experience in English language bridging courses and pre-tertiary English courses that we run here at Curtin and elsewhere. So this student says, you know, that when being asked whether linguistic diversity is encouraged or valued on Curtin campus, this student says, you know, replies, well, when I studied the language course in Curtin English, they all say that you should learn English. And because the English is the only language you use in the uni, so that's it. So we, you know, so that's why we're using English, because they've been told, even outside of the bridging English classes, that in the university, they must speak English. And he says, you get the message that you want to feel later on you're going to work in English, so better just speaking in English. So you feel it's not really encouraged or valued to use your own language? And he says, yes, yes. So this was quite enlightening, because initially we had worried that it was just the tasks that had prevented students from translanguaging, and it still could be. There were elements of those tasks that did not really facilitate extensive discussion in any language, really. But these interviews kind of showed us that there was more to it. There was a certain sense of fear among students about translanguaging. So in answer to our research questions then, how did Chinese students communicate during this discussion task? Well, we surmised that English language was sometimes a stumbling block. But we think the main problem was that these students had a strong monolingual English emphasis due to their pre-tertiary experiences of studying English only. And that could be at English language schools as well in the Perth area, or overseas even. But added to this, it's not just the fault of English language teachers who are a bit too zealous. Like in our Curtin English, we have a big sign across the door saying, speak English only or you will not progress. And you know, it's a bit of a mantra. But of course, added to this is their own expectations of what they should be doing. And they obviously, and quite rightly, assume that to be successful and to be accepted in their new university setting in an English-speaking country, that they should be speaking in English. And as we said, also, parents' expectations are huge. You know, even whole communities' expectations of them are huge. They should be successful and they should be able to adapt to their new setting. So this English-only mantra was very difficult for them to leave behind, even when the teacher encouraged them to translanguage. The other thing we should add here is that the teacher of this class was an English as an additional language speaker themselves. So perhaps the students just didn't trust that teacher and thought, oh, well, we don't trust you. If we get an Australian born and bred teacher, they might say differently because, you know, you've come from Mongolia, so maybe you think it's okay, but others might not. So there was that to it. With the second question, how might we sort of reduce these barriers? Because we really believe, and this is a very big space for us, that we argue strongly that translanguaging should be encouraged and should be enshrined in university policy, actually, at the top levels. So other people, of course, seeing this situation might argue, well, the only answer to this problem is to raise the level of English of students coming into courses. 6.5 is not high enough, it should be higher. That's not going to happen realistically for many reasons, of course, marketing reasons being the most sinister reason, in that, you know, international education is big dollars basically for Australian universities. So they are not going to increase the English level needed because it just would not be popular and would not produce the results they want. In light of that, then, we just believe it's better to convince our students that they are able to translanguage and they should use all their spatial resources in the classroom. Those students had laptops in front of them. They could have quickly looked into their laptop, used Google Translate. They could have done anything, really. You know, even phoned a friend. I don't know. They could have done anything to get around the obstacles they had rather than sit in silence. And we're advocating that that should be the case, that they should be encouraged to do that. And we can then break down the students' resistance and also other lecturers who aren't convinced of this in the university, break down their resistance. And what we believe we need to do is normalise linguistic diversity instead of normalising monolingualism in the dominant discourse, which is English, because Australia is at least 50% of people speak another language, but it's not being reflected in our educational spheres. So the implications then are basically we're fighting and advocating at university level to get policies changed. The current policies have come a long way. They do recognise cultural diversity. What they don't tend to recognise is linguistic diversity. They don't seem to understand that the two go hand in hand. And they certainly don't encourage full use of translingual repertoires. I mean, we're not naive. We're not suggesting this would be at the level of, say, examination or the level of assignments, because you may not have the lecturers who have the languages to be able to mark those assignments in different languages. But what we're just suggesting is in informal, unassessed activities that all students be allowed to and encouraged to use languages to achieve their the aims of knowing. At a course level, we are suggesting that coordinators should embed intentional translanguaging philosophies and practices into their units. There should be something on the first page of every unit outline or Blackboard page saying, please, if you have another language, utilise it. If you have another means of communicating, whether it be Auslan, whether it be through Google Translate, feel free to use it if it helps you to achieve the aim of understanding and knowing. And we should have the unit coordinators showing that they are perfectly okay with that. And at lesson level, you know, we should be making them aware of the positives of doing so, using their full translingual repertoires. And we should be embracing what we call intentional translanguaging, which has been talked about a lot by Tian and Shepherd Carey most recently. We've also published in the area, but, you know, Johnston, Seltzer, Garcia, all those people have talked about intentional translanguaging, where you deliberately get students to bring in texts in their own languages. Perhaps other students cannot understand those languages, but it's very simple for someone to read it out in their own language and then to summarize in English for them. We just want people to be hearing other languages, seeing other languages around them, seeing Arabic script, you know, and being aware that it goes from right to left rather than left to right. we really want our academics to understand more about languages. At the moment, it's pitiful. In this particular study, we found that most academics that we spoke to did not even know, A, what languages their students spoke in their classes, or B, when they heard a language, they couldn't recognize it. They couldn't even recognize Arabic, which, you know, is widely spoken here. So it was quite sad that was the case. However, we recognize, we're totally realistic. We realize that none of this can happen unless we somehow work with the pre-tertiary English language teachers in the English language teaching centers to somehow move them off of this kind of almost fanaticism with speaking English only 100% of the time, in not only in the classrooms, but in the corridors, in the lunchroom, wherever they are. You know, okay, it is going to enable you know, second language acquisition to some extent, but that all the research shows that the more you can use your own language around the place, the greater the chances are of you acquiring your additional languages to a high level. So that research is very clear about that. So we need to convince people of that. What time is it? Okay, I think I'm going to be finishing up in a minute. Okay, yeah, I am. Okay, so there are the references. One in particular, I think it's the one with the online, yes, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down, Dobson, Dryden, Dovchin, Gong, and Machia. That's actually an article in TESOL Quarterly that's just come out. So if you want to read more details about our study, you can read it in there. Yeah, it has got other sorts of examples in there and possibly more discussion. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll shut up now and see if anyone's got anything they want to ask me or discussion we can get going on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vincent, for that enlightening presentation on the translanguaging, especially in the Australia. Well, for ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, yeah, you may click on the raise hand button on your Zoom, or maybe you can just directly drop your question on the chat box. Well, oh yeah, here we have Professor Berlin here. Yes, Professor Berlin. Hello, Prof.
Excuse me, just before, should I get rid of the slides or shall I leave them up there? Or?
Oh, okay. You may close your slide.
Yeah, I think if I stop sharing, then I can.
Okay.
Oh, now I don't know how to get back to the.
Stop presenting.
No, I'm trying to get back to the to make it big screen. Ooh, sorry, I don't know what I've done there.
Okay.
I can't seem to get it into big screen again for me.
All right.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, so here we have Prof. Berlin Sibarani. Hello, Prof.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Uni.
Take your time.
Well, I think it's very interesting to talk about translanguaging, and I would like to contribute some experience of having a discussion with the Chinese lecturers. Well, I'm a director of a college running 2 study programs, Mandarin and English. And most of the students are Mandarin, just only a very minority English. When I have a discussion with the lecturers of the Mandarins, even in Bahasa Indonesia, they tend to keep silent. So I'm afraid this phenomena might not be dealing with the translanguaging, but this might be dealing with the personal attributes, which we know that Mandarin tend to be introvert. And I believe that they know the topic that we discuss, because we are talking about everyday problems of teaching in that college. So that is my first question, isn't it, about the psychological attributes of the students, not about translanguaging. Well, the second question is, well, I think you raised two research problems. The first is, how do they translanguage? Well, do you have any descriptions? Did you find anything that you can describe how they how do they do the translanguaging? Well, I see that it is in your finding or in your data, you talk about silence, and so on. And the second is, well, probably I would like to hear a little bit more about how do they ameliorate. Can you do the ameliorations through the strategy of teaching them or encouraging them to talk about the topic of the discussions, or through making them avoiding the developing a better psychological traits, moving from introvert to extrovert? I think that's what my questions are.
Okay. I'll try and answer your first one first, if I can remember it. In terms of psychological traits, such as I'm not a psychologist, but such as introversion and extroversion, I would tend to disagree with you that you can say that an entire group of people are introverted. Indeed, my colleague on this project is Chinese. She's definitely not introverted. And in fact, when I've taught whole classes of Chinese students, where they're all Chinese, they're definitely not. And this was English language. They were definitely not introverted. They were some of the most extroverted students I'd ever had, to the point where I actually found them so direct that I was grappling to know how to respond a lot, and also to try and get them to be quiet. They would just interrupt. They would just talk over each other. They would just do everything that, as a sort of British person, I found a little bit alarming. So I'm not sure that we can say that they're introverted. And because I've experienced this, I think it's actually down to how comfortable people feel in the situation they're in. And if they have got the means to communicate, the proficiency, the English language proficiency, that brings confidence, and that will allow you to convey your message. But you're quite right, there might be some personalities who just naturally are shy, whatever language they're speaking in. And that, you can't really get around that no matter what you do. Even if you ask them to translanguage, they probably won't. I do feel too, though, that quite a lot of the time, the silence comes about through lack of understanding. Because I know if I've gone to something where I didn't totally understand what was going on, I'm very reluctant to say anything. I will remain fairly silent because I don't want to make a fool of myself. So I think there's, I appreciate what you're saying. It's much more nuanced and much more complex than just language proficiency. It is, of course, psychological, and it's also very sociological, depends who's around you as well. So if you're with your peer group, particularly young people in universities, and I'll just add here that a lot of our Australian students are equally as reticent to speak. They often remain silent as well. It's also the age that they are. They do not want to make themselves look silly in front of their friends. And, after class, the friend might say, "Oh, I can't believe you said that. That's ridiculous," So that there are lots of pressures on them to perform publicly, which probably wouldn't happen if they're in their own little groups, in their own little, social groups, without that public sort of face that they have to put on. And particularly speaking in front of a large group, that is not going to work. I mean, these were put into small groups for that reason, because you know already that no one's going to speak in front of a large group. Nobody, unless they really know their stuff. So, yeah. I can't remember what your other question was, but I think I might have already covered it.
Yeah, it was about how do they trans language.
Oh, okay. You mean, well, at the moment,
about your data,
yeah, at the moment we're finding that they're not, and that's why we're trying to. Let me just explain this. They're probably translanguaging outside of the classroom, because when I was walking around Curtin University yesterday, and I heard people speaking French, I heard people speaking Arabic, I heard people speaking all manner of languages. But once they're in the classroom, I think it's like an unwritten code that you don't do that. And I'm not sure where that's coming from, although I suspect it's coming from our lecturers as much as anything else. But what we're trying to say is, of course, it's not going to be the whole story in the classroom. They can't just translanguage the whole time. But what we're trying to hope for is just more visibility of languages and translanguaging and translingual repertoires, and more acceptance of people using all of their resources to communicate. I'll give you an example. I was in Poland recently, and we got a tour up to the mountains, and the the Polish driver got in, and he did not speak one word of English. He only spoke Polish. In the car, there were us, we were English speakers, there were French speakers, there were Spanish speakers, there were Mandarin speakers. We're all in the car, in the van. What he did, he spoke in Polish into his phone. Each time we got to a site, he would talk about the site in Polish into his phone. He'd click Google Translate. Then while he was driving with one hand, which was pretty scary actually, he would put the phone to the back of the car and press it, and we would get it in English, exactly what he'd said in Polish. Then he'd press another button and it would come again in Spanish, and then he would press another, would come again in English. Now, he was translanguaging fantastically. He has a brilliant strategy for this world we live in now, where people cannot know every single language. So he was using every strategy he had, and he was resourceful. But we're finding that our students are not doing that in our classes. They're just remaining silent because they're fearful of doing stuff. So we want to make sure they understand that things like that are perfectly okay. If you're in a unit on international business or transcultural communication or something, it's perfectly okay to use resources to help you get your knowledge, even though you're going to be writing your assignment in English. That's what we're trying to get across to them. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's
Well, thank you, Tony Robinson.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Berlin, for the question. And Ms. Tony Robinson for information. Prof. Berlin here is one of our professors in our department. Yeah, so here we are in the English and Literature department, and he is one of our professors. Yeah.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you for your question.
Okay, now let's move to another questions. Anyone want to ask directly?
Hello.
Oh yeah, here we have Lidiman.
Hello. Yes.
Oh yeah, Pak.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, Tony Robinson.
Good morning.
It's nice to know you.
By the way, you can just call me Tony.
Tony, okay. Right,
it's a bit shorter.
Well, you mentioned about these the tests that discourage the translanguaging. I think I perfectly agree, because you picked up the topic of racism. I think this is quite a sensitive issue for Chinese people or Asian people in general, when we are under pressure of racism. So it's sort of a psychological impact, like I don't want to tell you so much about racism because I've gone through this. So I suppose you should have picked up another topic, another test, rather than racism, maybe kind of international relationship, a general topic. And that led to the sense of fear. You mentioned about the sense of fear of translanguaging. Of course, we Asian people, for example, silence doesn't mean that I don't know anything about what you're talking about, but silence means that I'm afraid of revealing the truth that I've experienced. So if this is an ethnographic observation or analysis, I suppose you should have picked up another topic rather than racism. And the second concern is that will Australia accept the fact that these migrants sort of invade Australia? So it's going to be a melting pot.
They don't
melting
invade.
Sorry.
We want them. We invite them.
Okay. You're also one of the migrants, right? So will this be like a melting pot, like in the United States? You welcome all people from all nations. So I believe that probably one of the languages of these people, migrants, may influence the grammar of English. You know, like Halliday, I think, has done so much research on this, that the Chinese language has 5 types of subject, while English is based on the Greek typology. Okay, like noun clause, noun is the subject, but in Chinese, they have a kind of concept, like a theme.
Mm.
Now, how would you respond to this? Will the Australian people accept the influence of this Chinese language or other languages that can actually interfere with the use of English?
I would like to be able to say most definitely they will, but I would say probably they won't.
Hopefully.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. So just addressing your last point there first, of course, even what we call so-called Australian English is now, it's very difficult to pin down. It's a combination of so many different varieties of English. And anyway, you know, even Australian English, which was based on English itself has so many borrowed words from India, from Chinese, everywhere. So that's the whole point we're trying to make, that there is, and the other thing is that when you're saying you need to speak English, what English are you saying you need to speak?
Exactly.
Are you saying you need to speak Indian English, Australian English, Aboriginal English? It's very elusive what this so-called English is. I'm on the examining board for year 12 exams, and it says distinctly in those exams you must use Australian Standard English in your response. But I'm constantly asking people, what is that? What is Australian Standard English? Am I speaking Australian Standard English? I'm from England.
Maybe not.
Quite often, it's interesting, the people who I meet with, the people who feel most strongly that students should be speaking Australian Standard English, the people who have an additional language themselves, people who don't speak Australian Standard English themselves. So people on my examiners board, particularly some of the Indian and Arabic speakers, they say no. It must be Australian Standard English. And so
we may assume that you have varieties of English there in Australia. So did you ask these students what sort of variety they learn before coming to Australia? Because I had the experience when I was in New Zealand. I met this Chinese student. Well, he always talked in polite English. Even when you say, "Do you like tea?" he would say, "Would you like tea?" Now, so I suspect that teachers in China always emphasize the use of polite English rather than whatever informal English or non-standard English. Okay. Did you ask the students that?
Indian speakers of English are much more polite than British English speakers.
Really?
They're because they've studied English literature. They use phrasing, quite old-fashioned phrasing. No, we didn't ask them. We didn't ask them about that. I've got some interference coming through.
I don't know. Yes, I heard that noise pollution though. Could be somewhere else. It's the mic.
Maybe hasn't got their mic muted.
The mic not tuned. Okay. So okay.
No, we didn't, and I fully take your point too about the topic. So that's why we sort of said we can't be sure that it was the English language itself that was preventing that discussion. We're aware that the question didn't really lead anywhere. Once you defined it, so you had done the task. But also, those are confronting questions. I have to add, though, that this unit is all about that. It's all about understanding and not judging. If you're in a business situation, you have to be aware of other people's backgrounds. You have to understand about things like being racist, stuff like that. So there's no way they can avoid these topics. They've signed up for this content. It's not like an English language class where you would choose probably a softer topic or something that was not as controversial. In these units, like even in the units I teach, we look at language and gender. We look at language and racism, linguistic racism. We look at hard stuff, because here in the university, the critical thinking is the thing that we all have to aim for, regardless of whether people feel uncomfortable or not. I mean, many Australians would feel very uncomfortable talking about that, but it has to be done because that's what they've signed. That's the unit they've signed up for. So. Thank you for your questions. It's very interesting for me to talk with you.
All right. Thank you very much also for your answer, Tony. And now we move to the chat box here. We're glad to have so many questions here from in the chat box. So here we have questions from Barley Kifli. Yeah, we go back. It's related to your research. He asked about why do you choose Chinese students? Chinese students were chosen as the participants of your research. Did you have special reason to choose them among the other foreigner students?
No, that's a really good question. We didn't, as I said, this is one sort of vignette, if you like, of a much larger study. So the entire study just looked at all students across campuses. So we actually looked at, we went to, and we did many faculties. We went to health sciences, we went to the business school, we went to science and engineering. So we didn't aim to look at just Chinese students at all. What happened was we just noticed that this happened in this particular class. When we also went to Mauritius and Curtin, Mauritius, and we observed classes where students were translanguaging between Creole, French, Hindi and English as well. But that's not, again, that's another part of the big study. So the only part we chose to focus on, because it is such a huge study, was this particular group. And I would agree totally that if we were to look at even another nationality background, we could have found quite different things. Because much as someone has pointed out, psychological differences, personality differences, etc. Of course, there are also, I don't want to sort of sound like it's stereotypes, but there are general ways of behaving that are endorsed across different cultures. So quite often when I have, say Somali students or Arabic speaking students, they may not be quite as reserved as international students as some of perhaps the Chinese students who we have. And I think too, you do get a different reaction when these are obviously a group of friends, these boys. And I think you do, and also the other thing I need to point out, I'm not being sexist, but gender is also important. I think on the whole, we find that our boys in our classes tend to speak up much less than our girls do. Not sure why that is. I think it's more about saving face. They don't want to look silly in front of other, when I say boys, these are men, but they're young adults, they're youth. They do not want to look silly in front of their colleagues. In fact, we find that when they're not with friends, they actually respond better because of this, what they're going to look like sort of thing that they worry about. So yeah, we didn't intend to get just Chinese, but we did. We've got so much data now, we have to go back and look at the Mauritian side, which will give us probably a totally different story, because over there it was just translanguaging non-stop. It was really different. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you. And next we have another question from Nazla. Yeah, she asked you about the strategies. What strategies you can share that the lecturer can adopt to create a supportive and inclusive atmosphere?
Oh, well, we'd welcome any strategies that you
Encourage
might have,
students to break free
actually.
from the English only
were
mindset.
hoping that you would, that's why we're doing this project. We're trying to find out from people what ideas they might have. We understood that just telling the students that they're able to translate, which just doesn't work. And I don't think it can really work anyway when there's only certain lecturers who are allowing it or encouraging it. Everyone has to get on board, and that's why we were saying every lecturer has to say in their class, like, I'm okay with you, or Curtin has a policy where we're all okay with you speaking your own languages. It has to be done as a whole. You can't really do it just one academic does it in this class like it is at the moment, or one does it in this class, because they don't trust you then. They think, oh no, it's only you that's allowing me to do this. Everyone else will think badly of me. So the only strategy we can think of is, yes, to encourage and endorse by telling them, but we also understand that everyone has to do that. And we also feel that it needs to be enshrined in policy where they can see that this is definitely an okay thing to be doing. And some of the things I do, I mean, I go out on a limb. As I said, I just the other week, I got a student to bring in the Chinese national anthem. I teach a unit called Language and Society. And we were looking at language and power, and I got them to bring in the Chinese national anthem in Mandarin, as I said, and they read it out. And there were no other Chinese students in the class, but it was just interesting to hear it in Mandarin. And she then translated it, and it was fantastic, because if she'd brought in the English version, it would be already translated. And so we would get whoever's translated its view of what this national anthem is. But she told us what it meant and how she understood it. And, it was great. And everyone really enjoyed hearing it. And then another time we had someone that brought something in Arabic again. And just even for other students to see Arabic script written, they asked lots of questions about it, and do you have difficulty changing from left to right to left? It just broadens students' horizons linguistically. They're not going to learn another language out of it, but they're just going to become aware that those languages are important and value them. At the moment, we feel like they're not being valued. So the kids in the grade 2 class, the primary school that I go to, we feel like those kids, their languages are not being valued. And similarly, they're then being penalized for not speaking English brilliantly. So they're kind of in this weird zone where they feel bad because they can't speak English in their mind properly, but they don't feel good about their own language either, because that's not celebrated. And also there's the danger of them losing their first language as well, which is the other thing we're looking at, which is quite a serious problem, especially for Aboriginal languages. We now only have 20 left out of 250. So that's another issue that's quite a serious problem. And so we're working with the teacher in the primary classroom. We're co-teaching with him, and we're doing little things where we get the kids to go home and ask their parents for some words in say Punjabi or in Mandarin or whatever languages they have at home. And they'll bring them in and they'll maybe teach a couple of words to one of the children next to them in a group or something. And the kids love it, by the way. They actually love getting these words. Even the Australian kids love it, because they can then say, oh, I know these words in Arabic, shukran or whatever, or, that just empowers everybody, I think. I can't remember what the original question was, but if I answered it or not.
All right. So we still have so many questions here, but I will only take one more question, due to the limit of our time. So one more question comes from Pak Surya. So he asked that translanguaging in the classroom functions well. In the classroom functions well when the children and the teacher share the same minority language. But in many other classrooms, students come from many different language backgrounds. So how can translanguaging take place then?
Well, that's my whole argument, that you don't need to speak the language, because if we relied on that, we would have teachers in Australia who are monolingual, they only speak English. So that has been the argument of language teachers over the decades, I suppose. But we have to look beyond that now, because translanguaging is not actually about translating. That's the thing. It's not that you are, say, like I taught in the Middle East for a long time, and they were all Arabic speakers. My Arabic's not bad, but in that case, I would be, I guess, allowing them to use their own language so that I could understand what they were saying. In this case, it's not important if the teacher or the academic does not understand what they're saying, what the students are saying. In fact, we have some very interesting conversations from other groups that we took, and we haven't translated the French and the Creole yet, but there was another group from Hong Kong in another class that were talking, and they were translanguaging a lot, but nothing to do with the topic of the class. And they were saying some very funny things about the teacher themselves in Cantonese. And so we got someone to translate it who knew Cantonese, and we were just laughing, because it was saying that, that the students were saying things like, "What's she talking about now? I have no idea what she means." And then they're saying, "Oh, but I like that dress that she's wearing today." And things like this. So it was very funny, that situation. But the problem is you could feel threatened by that. But what we're saying is you don't need to feel threatened by that. You need to stand back as the teacher and allow the students to be totally student-centered, to talk in their groups. If there's some of them that have the same language, that's great. If there isn't, then someone who speaks Arabic might say, well, in my language, we would say this, and the others would go, "Oh, okay, that's amazing. What is it again?" And they would just listen. So there's always you can moderate it, to be a big thing or a small thing. What we're aiming for is just to make linguistic diversity in a classroom a norm, rather than as something that's seen as unusual. That's what we're aiming for. And it's not about necessarily excluding anyone, like, okay, you've got people who, like with some of the kids in the school I go to, they're Shona, they speak Shona. Well, no one else in the class speaks Shona, but they feel proud. They say, "This is what I say in Shona. Listen to me. This is how I say it in Shona." And everyone goes, "Oh, that sounds amazing." They don't understand what he's saying, but it's about identity, I guess. What we're trying to promote is identity, and that, okay, you're a migrant here in Australia, but you don't have to become a robot, someone who only speaks English, with your linguistic identity totally submerged in the classroom. That's, I guess, what we're trying to promote. Is all I can say about that. Right.
So enriching their language also, right? Okay.
Yeah, enriching, exactly.
Okay. So Tony, please allow me to read one more question. Yeah, just a simple question from Mr. Jose here. He asked that, does translanguaging happen more often to those learners whose English is their foreign language than the second language one?
I'm not quite sure I understand that. So does translanguaging happen with foreign language learners? And what was the last bit?
To those learners whose English is their foreign language than the second language.
So more with foreign language learners than second language. Well, in Australia, we don't talk about second language learners anymore. We talk about additional language learners, because most of our learners have definitely more than 2 languages. So it's not a second language for them. It may be 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever. So we talk about additional language. I would say translanguaging in a foreign language classroom is going to be much more of the scenario that the person who just asked me the previous question is talking about, where you might be teaching English like I was in Egypt, And, you know, I say to the class, okay, you can use Arabic to talk to each other, to work something out. That's okay. That would be that kind of translanguaging, but that's quite different. That's basically using translation as a tool, is the way I see it. So in a foreign language context, you're not necessarily talking about translanguaging in the same kind of way as you're talking about it for people in a place where the dominant language is English, because there you have to make an extra effort to get people to bring their languages in, whereas in a foreign language context, from my memory, I remember trying to stop the students from speaking Arabic so much when the aim of the lesson was English language learning. So it's a different scene, and I think that probably we wouldn't talk about translanguaging so much as a foreign language, but more as you call it, a second or an additional language in an English-speaking context would be more what we were talking about, where the dominant discourse is in English. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Tony Robinson, for the insightful presentation you gave us today. And ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of our webinar on translanguaging, English only and silence in the university classroom, let me wrap up a little bit from the presentation. So here we have listened that translanguaging is a language practice and pedagogical approach that involves using multiple languages flexibly and seamlessly within a single conversation or interaction. It goes beyond the traditional view of languages as separate entities and encourages language users to draw upon all their linguistic resources to communicate effectively. And translanguaging is not only about incorporating different languages into communication, but also recognizing the interconnectedness of these languages and using them in a complementary way. It allows speakers to maximize their communicative competence, regardless of which language they use at any given moment. And well, ladies and gentlemen, before we end this session, I would like to extend my gratitude to our esteemed speaker. And we also would like to give you an online certificate here. Maybe our chief could share, could give it to Tony officially.
Okay.
To Nasir.
Okay,
Please.
thank you, Tony, for your translating, because this is really related to our country. A lot of questions will be asked, but the time is limited us. So we can give you more than that, more than a question, more question. This time is limited. We just can't give you only a certificate. Hoping you can accept this, and hoping that you will be able to share with us again in a few next, if you have time to give us another explanation.
Sure, why not?
Hoping that because this is really related, because so many questions will become, but the time is such as, what about the achievement about translanguaging? Let us speak their language, but some of them understand English, and the achievement of the subject they get is that different with the student really master English compared to the student only understand not so much English. What about the achievement of their subjects, such as in business, such as in language, whatever is that? So that is so many questions later on, if you have time to share us, to teach us. Thank you for your time to share with us, and hoping your knowledge will be useful for all the participants here. And also, thank you for all the participants for giving you time to listen to the Associate Professor Tony Davidson about translanguaging. English only. Okay, thank you, Tony, for your time.
Thank you very much. And yes, I hope not just to teach, but to learn. I can learn a lot from your very extensive experience and wisdom in the area as well.
Hoping you can come over and to a research in our country.
I can.
Because
I can
we
if
have
you
so
invite
many
me.
problem about like you said, we call that foreign language, but you said that is additional language. That is a different term, right? Foreign and additional. We have so many local language, and then we have Indonesian language, and then we have to teach English language. So we call that foreign language. But another time we call that additional language. So we have to learn more about it, about this problem. We have so many problems about this. Remember, we have so many language in Indonesia, local language.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's fantastic.
Then they have to study Indonesian language, and the teachers who teach, but sometimes the teacher also teach in local language. But while they teach in local language, also they directly teach English language. That's really, confusing. That is the problem. You should do research.
English is a medium of English as a medium of instruction is another big area for me on the legitimacy of such practices. But anyway, that's something again to really think about.
Okay, thank you, Tony. It's
All
really
right,
interesting.
Tony and Sir, before we end this session, I would like to invite all the audience to turn on the camera because we're going to take a screenshot for the session. Please, everyone. Okay, I'm going to take a screenshot for the first slide for 1, 2, 3. And then for the second slide. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Camera on, everyone. Okay, next, the third slide. The fourth. And the fifth. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Tony.
Hopefully we'll meet again.
Yes, we will.
We hope that.
Thank you, Professor Tony.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening. I very appreciate your questions and as I said, your experience and knowledge. Thank you. I have to go now.
Yes, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be in touch, Aretna.
Okay. Okay.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Miss Tony.
Oke, Pak Ari, saya rasa setelah selesai semua, terima kasih seluruh peserta yang telah mau berbagi waktu yang memang mungkin belum puas ya, Bapak Ibu ya, jawabannya.
Betul. Betul, belum puas itu Pak Natsir.
Betul sekali Pak.
Artinya kita juga bisa buat forum kita sendiri untuk membahas
tentang ini ya Pak ya.
Translanguaging itu.
Iya.
Karena nyerempet juga dengan code switching.
Iya. Sekali Pak.
Code mixing dan yang lain-lain.
Kita pun kelihatannya berhubungan sangat erat dengan problematik yang dia kasih tadi ya Pak ya. Iya.
Oke.
Terlalu banyak local language kita nih ya kan Prof.
Sampai jumpa di tempat di kesempatan yang lain.
Oke, thank
ya,
you.
Ibu Yeni Erlita yang menggagasi itu mungkin untuk di tingkat jurusan.
Benar sekali dengan Ibu Juli ini Prof dan Pak Aryan.
Ya. Ibu Yeni ini ketua jurusan, ketua prodi saya Pak.
Oh.
Ibu Juli sastra ya.
Iya, Ibu Juli dan Pak Ari, Ibu itu Pak Ari ini.
Setidaknya pakar kita sudah ada, tetapi dalam in the classroom konteks ya kan?
Iya.
Itu ketua chapter Sumatera Utara Teflin, koordinator.
Ada
memang kajian
betul.
But different terms used, ya kan? Pedagogical translation. Now popularly used translanguaging.
Ya. Jadi sebenarnya ini makhluk apa ini translanguaging ini perlu kita bedah dulu ya.
Betul kali Prof. Berlin itu, seperti Prof. bilang tadi tuh, itu nyerempet ke code switching, ke code switching, ya,
yang mana?
code
Jadi
switch,
nyerempet
code
ke
mix,
mana?
yang mana sebenarnya itu?
Ya,
Jangan-jangan itu dulu istilahnya memang code switch and code mix.
ya dia
Terus
bilang,
menjadilah itu translation.
Jadi translating ini.
Belakangan menjadi translanguage. Ya itu trans kan, to transfer one language to another language.
tapi dia tadi menekankan translanguaging itu bukan translating.
Ya.
Dia
No,
tekankan tadi, ya.
not translating.
Jadi artinya kita perlu mengkaji dulu referensi untuk membahas ini. Ini makhluk apa ini, kira-kira gitu.
Iya.
Oke, ini
Ini di
titipan ini
digital
Ibu Deli
era kan
sama
mereka
Ibu
tadi
Juli
dikatakan menggunakan Google, terutama pakai apanya inilah gazetnya selalu. Paling mudah sekarang kan udah pakai gazet kan. Kok dulu kan open dictionary. Nah, manual dictionary. Nah, kalau sekarang udah bisa langsung pakai digital dictionary-nya dia gitu.
Saya minta izin Pak Ketua.
Oke lah, thank you.
Ya, terima kasih semuanya. Waktu bagi semuanya yang telah kita lakukan hari ini. Nah, semoga kelihatannya ini agak baru, makhluk yang baru. Tadi baru Prof. Berlin bicara dengan Pak Rahman. Berbicara apakah ini sudah bergeser code switching, alih kode, campur kode menjadi translation. Nah, ini bisa kita diskusikan nanti. Menjadi mata kuliah kemungkinan ini Pak Rahman atau Pak Ketua. Perlu belajar lagi kelihatannya kita ini. Oke, Pak Ketua jurusan, Pak Ari.
Oke, permisi ya.
Iya, terima kasih Pak Rahman yang sudah berkenan hadir hari ini. Bumi, banyak sekali yang nggak mungkin kita singgung satu persatu. Telah dari Prof. Sumarsi juga ada tadi banyak yang hadir.
Oke, izin ya, izin ya.
Terima kasih semuanya. Hoping we can see you on the next Friday forum later on. We will publish the time when we open a new chapter. And thank you for Templin coordinator for collaborating with us. Thank you, Ibu Coordinator, Ibu Dr. Masitowarni, for join us. So this FGD will be running as we hope. Thank you, Ibu Bapak Ketua jurusan Head Department, Department, Ibu Moderator, all the team in Friday Forum. See you on the next Friday Forum. Oke, Pak Ketua. Pak Ketua.